SCP-4077, City of Gold. 4077 is a Keter-class SCP, and the containment procedures are as follows. All information related to 4077 is to be maintained on a redundant RAISA ontotemporal isolated server and encoded in the solid archive during the next write-accessible interval. Foundation historians are to monitor academic outlets specializing in the history and literature for newly uncovered 4077-A narratives, which should be removed from circulation, archived, and replaced with approved forgeries. Any individuals claiming to have encountered 4077 are to be detained and fully debriefed, with their statements recorded as 4077-A narratives. Affected Foundation personnel may be placed on memetics to improve account accuracy. Effective 3/26/2009, no resources are to be allocated to locating 4077. The description is as follows. 4077 is an undiscovered covert facility located in a variable but always remote location. 4077 is at least 2 square kilometers in area and roughly follows standard Foundation construction practices of before a redacted date. Certain described features suggest that 4077 contains advanced technology not currently available outside of the Foundation. No physical evidence for 4077 exists at any location. 4077 is only known to the Foundation through 4077-A narratives. 4077 narratives are a collection of pseudo-historical documents, written histories, and personal testimonies centering on a mythical or lost civilization, city, or location. The description of 4077 is identical between 4077-A narratives, although some contain particular features or period vernacular. These narratives range from the classical period to the present, but even the oldest reports include some sufficient detail concerning security practices and paratechnology to represent a Class 4 information security breach. Beyond a claim that 4077 contains something of great value to the author or characters in the narrative, very few 4077-A narratives contain any information concerning the interior, inhabitants, or capabilities of 4077. The only 4077-A narratives with any information concerning the interior are summarized below. It is believed that these narratives have been intentionally left intact as a warning. De Justis Britonum. On the Deeds of the Britons. 1136 CE. Geoffrey of Monmouth's pseudo-historical record by the rulers of the Britons, including the biography of King Arthur. In this record, 4077 is located on the Isle of Avalon, where Arthur is taken after he is mortally wounded by Mordred. Although it is said that Arthur will recover from his wounds, this journey is the last event in Arthur's myth. 4077 is described as being entirely self-sufficient, capable of producing unlimited amounts of agriculture and manufactured goods. Additionally, non-anomalous human inhabitants of 4077 have a lifespan of centuries. Letter of Prester John. 1150 CE. A letter to Western medieval leaders from the king of a mythical Christian nation in the Three Indies. The modern security system of 4077 is described in detail, although using period vernacular and mythological metaphor. 4077 is claimed to contain a wealth of religious artifacts and an army to battle the forces of Gog and Magog. Kitab al-Qunutz, the Book of Hidden Pearls. 1254 CE. A suppressed Arabic treasure hunting manual describes 4077 as an oasis city as white as doves, located deep in the Saharan desert. protecting a sleeping king and queen. It can only be accessed by delivering a secret key to a waiting bird. Confession of Juan Martinez, 1529 CE. The deathbed confession of a Spanish conquistador who deserted from an expedition seeking the legendary city of either La Ciudad Blanca or Manoña, depending on the version. This city, 4077, is described as being a ringed bastion-style fort, topped with bronze idols. Martinez fled the expedition and was discovered by natives, who blindfolded him and took him to 4077 after learning that he was a Christian. Inside, he witnessed the coronation ceremony of the Gilded King, El Rey Dorado. Data expunged. Martinez was asked to stay and learn the ways of the natives, but decided instead to return to his home. No other records of this expedition exist. SCP-4077 was first identified in a collection of 4077-A narratives from the archives of the Vatican Holy Office for Secrets and Prophecies in 1964. The Holy Office suppressed these narratives from the 3rd to the 19th century by pressuring authors and circulating alternate rumors without reference to 4077. The Holy Office lacked sufficient enough context to identify the facility and viewed 4077 as an info hazard related to Solomon's Temple. After the Foundation assumed containment responsibilities, a search of Foundation archives produced several additional 4077-A narratives in the form of personal statements and intelligence debriefings. These instances are attached below, and I will be reading them verbatim. The first document is a field report from His Majesty's Foundation for Secure Containment of the Paranormal, dated January 25, 1905. It reads as follows. We crossed Namaqualand with a regiment of Her Majesty's Rifles, supported by a camel train under the pretext of sweeping civilization, and Boer guerrillas from the valleys between Kaliavana and Springbok. We marched north through the Kalahari Desert and up into the desolate Naamub. As we crossed the coastal sand seas, rocky outcrops, and sand dunes reaching 100 yards in height, the archaeologist waxed poetic on the timeliness of the place. This desert was endlessly ancient, with her sand dunes forming boundless, unreachable curves and sweeping eons before man first walked on the earth. After months of grueling foot travel, we finally broke a high stony escarpment and found the structure originally reported by the Canadian explorer Fenari. Its many component structures were massive, slab-sided and whitewashed, rivaling the largest factories of London for size. It was impossible to determine their defenses. Concrete blockhouses were spaced around the perimeter of the structure, but they were dotted with strange electrical equipment rather than the mouths of field pieces or the bristle of rifle barrels. The archaeologist, the linguist, and I drew straws, and I was selected to remain behind with a rear guard to observe. It was perhaps unfair that the antiquarian should remain behind, but to be plain, I was partially relieved. Atlantis, Wise, Avalon. No matter how closely this island in the desert sea matched those stories, the contents could not possibly live up to the legends. I watched through my field glasses, and they slowly grew smaller in the face of the great behemoth, the khaki-clad platoons backing them quickly blurring from my sight into the sand. Just as they began to approach an opening in the structure, a gust of wind kicked up, coating my field glasses with sand and stinging my eyes. By the time I had rubbed them clean, it was all gone. The forward party, the structure, even my rear guard, and the camel train with my gear. I was alone in the desert. I ran down the escarpment, trying to find the advanced party, hoping against hope that it was all a mirage or a sudden shift of the sand. But there was nothing. I do not know how many days I had to crawl through the desert before once more reaching the more fertile Kalahari. It was only by the grace of God that I survived. I know it took weeks in the care of passing tribesmen before I regained even a semblance of my humanity. After bartering a few of my remaining possessions, I traveled south to Springbok. There, I discovered the war with the Boers had been resolved over 2 years ago, and our fateful regiment had never been called to service. When I traveled home for London, I discovered men I knew from the field happily ensconced in their labors as butchers or teamsters, having never worn the khaki. My family did not mark my extended absence as peculiar, but then, as a man of my vocation, they rarely did. The archaeologist I discovered dutifully pursuing his work for the Society in one of the many secluded manors sheltering his possessions of His Majesty's Foundation for the secure containment of the paranormal. Of the linguist, I could find nothing at all. The next document was recovered from a GOC debriefing on August 1st, 1953. A lot of people stepped out of the gray during World War II. I turned in my resignation as a field agent after the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. At that point, the Foundation was still trying to keep people from leaving, but my tradecraft and connections gave me a lot of places to run. They had completely abandoned the policy by 1940. They simply couldn't hope to hold back everyone who wanted to take part. For those of us who stepped out of the shadows, Bachman was indisputably the worst. I first knew him as a particularly vehement chaos insurgency operative. Rumor had it he had been a young zealot in the original uprising, but had been even more enthusiastic about the purges than the message. In the years after that, he pursued the anomalous with a ruthless violence unmatched by any but Mr. Dark himself. It was no surprise when he ended up with the Nazis. It was never clear to me if he was the CI's Quisling or if he had completely switched sides. But by 1935, he was appointment for the SS Aberdeen, Hitler's personal occult bloodhounds. He spent most of the pre-war years murdering and torturing his way through the antiquarian and occult communities, tracking down anything anomalous that could even be remotely connected to the Aryans. By late 1944, the Germans were getting desperate. Bombers were perpetually raining death on German cities. The Allies were rolling up territories on either side, and she simply didn't have the troops to keep the war going. It was at this point that a crooked officer in Abwehr slipped us a communique from Bachmann to his superiors. They had assumed it was a code because they weren't aware of the Foundation's lingo. My commander in the OSS, our Office of Strange Services, knew to some extent what I had done before the war, and called me back from the field of operations to advise on this assignment. What we had was an aerial reconnaissance photo of a covert facility somewhere in the Scandinavian mountains. My superiors were convinced almost immediately that it was a Foundation site. It had the hallmark triple redundant security installations, but none of the activity of a military installation. It had clearly been complete for some time, as it lacked the ramshackle appearance of American or Soviet science cities or German labor camps. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I had had significant clearance back in the day, specializing in secure Keter-class objects, but I had never seen or heard of a site this size anywhere in the region. Bachmann believed this to be one of the mythical dark sites that had gone off the grid during the CI's uprising. He had some convoluted evidence about the site containing an XK-class apocalypse, which he had filtered through Hitler's positive Christianity. but I couldn't make heads or tails of it, not my area of expertise. What mattered was, he was absolutely convinced that whatever was contained there could be appropriated and used to turn the tide for Germany. People on both sides were getting raged at this point. But while the cracks were starting to show for the rest of us, Bachmann seemed to have shattered. He had spent the last decade propping up the myth of the Aryan Volk, and there was nothing left for him outside of that. That, or he was a damn convincing double agent. What we had at this point wasn't so much a plan as the necessity to get involved. They dropped me and a dozen Norwegian resistance fighters out of a Handley Page Halfix into a god-forsaken, windswept bluff. I wasn't much on skis, but I was the only one handy who held a Foundation clearance and had any knowledge of standard security protocols. We had arrived 2 days ahead of 100 crack Gebirgsjäger mountain troops, led by a gaggle of SS officers and Bachmann himself. We were woefully outnumbered and outgunned, but we had only two objectives. First, we were to establish radio contact with the facility and warn them of an incoming hostile GOI. Second, my job was to identify Bachmann and anyone else with Foundation experience and put them down. If capture seemed likely, this included me. We simply couldn't afford to let the Nazis into any kind of facility. One of our sharpshooters broke his leg in the jump, so we had to leave him. The SS found him at the drop site and brought him along. At night, we knew how close behind us they were by the sound of his screams. The mountains were getting treacherous, and by twist of terrain and weather, we only arrived a few hours before the Germans. We set up a defensive position in a copse of trees facing what appeared to be the main entrance to the facility. Radio was no luck. Our equipment couldn't transmit or receive. We knew the facility was surrounded by equipment, but I had assumed it was some kind of containment apparatus. If this was primarily a covert facility, it might have been some kind of jammer. By the time the German ski troops had arrived, Bachmann was completely enraptured. The Jaegers clearly wanted to establish a perimeter, but he and the SS officers would have none of it. We watched them try portable radios and fail, and then they marched right towards the entrance like kids in a candy store. None of the SS toadies were anyone I knew, and their grunts and non-coms clearly weren't doing any talking. At about 100 yards from the facility, I gave the signal. 4 sharpshooters fired, and Bachmann danced as 3 shots took him. Blood spouted from a hit in the neck, while his upper body pivoted one direction from a shot in the ribs, and his legs went another from a hit in the thigh. The other sharpshooters rang shots in the brief moment before he fell, taking down a number of the SS officers. The Waffen SS were the only ones responsible for anti-guerrilla death squads, so resistance fighters were never the ones to let them out of their sight. Bachmann's body hit the ground, and the remaining officers broke and ran for the cover of the facility. Then they were all gone. The Jaegers, the SS, Bachmann's corpse, and any sign that the facility had ever been there. Nothing. We searched the whole area for evidence, trash, blood, dropped weapons, before we thought to count our number, see if anyone had been lost during the brief chaos. We found we were one too many. The man who had been hurt in the jump was limping along with us as we frantically searched. Our team leader greeted him with jubilation, but I had to quietly talk a few of the other men down from shooting him. My Foundation training speaking again. When something anomalous happens, isolation and study are the first priorities, not superstition. After we had satisfied ourselves that the facility was well and truly gone, we made our way down the mountains to our extraction point. Everything from then on went to plan. Our mission was still on record and declared a rousing success. But the photo and coded messages were gone. Bachman had died with a whole gaggle of Thule Society fucks in 1929. I could never trust the Foundation after that. The idea that they not only had the level of power, but were willing to use it, seemed to invalidate everything I had ever believed about them. It had made everything I had done in their service entirely futile. I moved from the OSS to the GOC as soon as the option was available, and have been here ever since. Along with this GOC debriefing, there is a archivist note. When reached through typical channels, the Global Occult Coalition refused to provide any access to the author of this report. Interviews with Norwegian guerrillas identified from this report and OSS records confirm the general evidence, but have provided no additional information. The final document is a recovered statement from Dr. Sylvia Ben Yair on June 15, 2008. If the words Thaumiel class anomaly mean nothing to you, stop reading. And for those of you who fall under this category, you can stop the video here. You will miss nothing at all. I'm joking, of course. We're here to read, aren't we? If my suspicions are correct, then you're gonna need context for this. I was in the Foundation counterintelligence for 15 years before SCP-1422, the Yellowstone anomaly. The O5 Council took this gap of knowledge about as well as a kicked beehive. They had us chasing intelligence and interrogating personnel without end. We had no idea why this was so important, but knowing was not part of our job. 6 months later, I learned why. I was no longer a red right hand. I was a Thaumiel class containment specialist, backed by a team of agents and researchers. They gave me a PhD for appearance sake and a level 4 clearance with a list of access code words and numbers 4 pages long. The research budget for my group was indefinite. The council stated that I would need approval for something like a space launch or a new site, but that would almost certainly be granted. I was given one mission: to identify the lost Foundation sites or technology and return it to the fold. The most basic function of the O5s is to know when something should stay buried. But the discovery of SCP-2000, Deus Ex Machina, had created a form of mania in them. You must understand, 2000 had completely came out of the dark. There was no records of its construction, no hidden level 5 archives, no unwritten institutional knowledge, nothing. The technology housed there was beyond a dream. We have had working Scranton devices for decades, but Yannick's constant temporal sinks? The O5s would not even admit that Yannick's was an employee. The capabilities of 2000 were revolutionary, and a majority of the council were either excited or terrified that there could be another Thaumiel site out there. As I read more files, I came to understand. They now had the power to see the future, escape the planet, and roll back disaster. They could not accept that more power could be outside of their grasp. I could not go into this looking for the next 2000 or 1422. Things you cannot remember are a problem for someone else. And for a site with no connection to the current timeline, I'm not a miracle worker. I do not need a budget. I needed data. I approached this problem with the same way I would rolling up a double agent. If you want to catch a mole, you give them an opportunity to expose themselves. If you want to understand a mole, you look for what they have hidden. To that end, I looked for the things the Foundation desperately needed and could not find. For example, material. Given the entangled web of front companies and contractors, tracking basic construction material was an impossibility. Specialty materials were more enlightening. The beryllium-bronze alloys, superconductors, and modern ceramics used in paratechnology were based on easily available resources and well within the manufacturing capabilities of the present Foundation. Despite this, there was always a perpetual critical shortage of these items and a constant backlog of orders for them. Personnel. The Foundation has always been more secular than the general population statistically. This did not explain the number of rush hiring orders and approved conscriptions of non-employees for religious purposes. Enterprise. Given the well-established potential for religious XK-class end-of-the-world scenarios, eschatological research in the Foundation was anemic. The Department of Theology was underfunded, lacking qualified experts, and was spread thin between dozens of SCPs. Basic competence. The lack of dedicated personnel or even elementary comprehensive research for retro-casual phenomena was frankly inexcusable. For the dozen or so retro-casual SCPs, drastic mishandling was the rule, not the exception. Retro-casually has become the best model for my hypothetical lost site, but there were no real experts or protocols to assist me. At this point, a frivolous database search turned up a near-forgotten Euclid SCP-4077. The Foundation had simply accepted the Vatican Holy Office's version of this SCP as a literary oddity, and failed to identify 4077 as a Foundation site. It was my team who identified the HMF, SCP, and GOC records and tied them to SCP-4077. SCP-2000's array of XACTS had been operating with an automated state for centuries in the current iteration of history, and had stored petabytes of performance data. These logs showed a unique spike in temporal sync power draw on the two known dates, with matching spikes in power on a variety of dates throughout history. These included all the dates of religious predictions of the apocalypse, all of them incorrect. I felt I had enough of an operating theory to report to the O5s. We had identified a hypothetical thaumial site with a high probability of the following features: temporal sync-based historical alteration technology, enterprise in religious XK-class end-of-the-world scenarios, active interface with the historical events for at least 1,000 years, a tendency to alter history to remain hidden. This left one question: why were they still in hiding? The O5s were not interested in allowing me to find out. It had been a year since SCP-2000, and their enthusiasm for thaumials had been blunted. I knew through back channels that my project was not the only crash search program. Several of the others had managed only to locate things the O5s wanted to stay hidden. Cancellations and strong amnestics were not far behind. I believe my project was overlooked because I had not been frivolous with my resources, and because they didn't take any of my work seriously. When I asked to take over SCP-4077 as a lead researcher, their intermediary actually laughed. There was no way they would condone pursuing my theory. But I do not care. I know SCP-4077 is out there. The world is shrinking, and there are not many places left that a large facility can hide. Poor weather and extreme temperatures are necessary to hide from aircraft and spy satellites the majority of the time. I am not a specialist in geolocation, but I know those who are. The O5s have not rescinded my authority to access the resources yet, and I do not intend to give them the chance. I'm going to find 4077. And if you find this note in the solid archive, maybe you can follow in my tracks. Dr. Sylvia Benier, Lead Researcher, SCP 4077.